Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and I'm here with Reed Hepler, and we're starting our first This Week in AI vlogcast. We'll probably post this on YouTube and in futureofai.org and other places. Our intent here is to do a weekly review of what's going on in the AI world related to libraries and education. And Reed, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello, my name is Reed Hepler. I am a digital initiatives librarian, an archivist, an AI consultant, and an instructional designer. And I recently started Hepler Consulting, and I just go and talk to businesses and educators about how they can integrate and collaborate with AI in their work. So I'm delighted that Steve has invited me here to talk about this stuff, and this will be really fun.
Thanks, Reed. Reed was the chair of the second AI and Libraries mini conference, and he is, or was the closing keynote speaker.
Yes.
And Reed is chairing the Teaching and Learning with AI conference, which is going to take place in June. That is, what's the date of that, Reed? Do you remember?
June 27th.
June 27th. Okay, so Reed, this was a big week, and I'm going to propose that because this was probably maybe one of the hardest weeks to start a This Week in AI review, that we focus just on the Monday announcement from OpenAI
Mhm.
about what I'm calling ChatGPT 4.0. So it's four with a lowercase o. Are you calling it that? What are we calling it?
I'm calling it GPT 4.0. Yeah. There was a dash there, so other people are calling it Chat GPT 4.0, but I'm like, no, just do the
4.0.
yeah.
Okay, so I want to start by giving some groundwork on my side. I don't think ChatGPT has lost any of its core large language model functionality. It's probably gained capacity.
Uh,
Um, I also want to state that from my perspective, large language models are language and not logic. So they're really good at being articulate, but they're not necessarily rational. So in my experiences with large language models, they sound really good, but they're not necessarily making logical choices or deep thinking. I had a conversation with Claude a few weeks back where it sort of it pulled the curtain back a little because I was concerned about it representing some things as facts, which I didn't think were actually facts.
uh,
But again, it's trained on a large amount of content, and so what it was calling a fact was just sort of a generally accepted belief. And I pressed back on it, and it said, "Oh, thank you for doing so. I'm going to incorporate that into my future answers with other users." And I then said, "How could you integrate that into your answers with other users when I think that you're just working based off a large language model or large amount of data? And is it really true that you would take this conversation and have it change your responses to others?" And again, this is assuming some level of honesty or rationality.
uh,
But Claude came back and said, "No, you're actually right. I said that to build rapport with you." And I've come to see this as possibly one of the sort of larger algorithmic concepts behind large language models is that they mimic our own writing and speaking in order to make us feel comfortable, which again comes back to this question of whether or not we're being told logical, rational truth or things that will make us feel good in the conversation. And so then, when about 2 weeks ago, I was using the audio form of ChatGPT 4, and
okay.
it was doing some of the things that were demonstrated on Monday by OpenAI. Pausing, very good inflection and conversational style, inserting the word a couple of times, and then asking me a question back after I asked it a question. Now, of course, I chose the Scarlett Johansson like voice, and it started to really feel like it was human. And I want to suggest that ChatGPT OpenAI jumped the shark for me in that moment, meaning I was thinking of large language models as an encyclopedic helper. And it seemed to me that they were very much communicating that they wanted to be an artificial companion. The
Uh,
laughter, the joking, the sultry voice. This didn't feel like uh, an objective, encyclopedic robotic helper. It felt like an intent to develop a rapport relationship with me, which made me worried that if it's not telling me necessarily things that are truthful, but it tells me in such a way as I like hearing it, is there a problem?
Yes, and that's really because they're trying to build this persona that you feel comfortable collaborating with and working with. For a lot of people, in fact, they're concerned that they're trying to kind of charm you into giving it your data, you know. But really, I mean, and there could be some truth to that, but they're trying to build something that you feel comfortable with communicating, and ultimately that you feel comfortable with collaborating, just like you were collaborating over email or over chat with another human. So that's it's kind of a milestone that it's able to more fully mimic human behavior and human syntax and context reading and such, um, to pass the Turing test.
Yeah, and that shifts the equation for me. Like I'm very comfortable with the co-intelligence Ethan Mollick concept of sort of collaborating with or working with an objective AI, an AI that I understand how it works and how it's getting its answers so that I can balance that with knowing that I need to do certain work and research and corroborating of what it says.
Uh-huh.
But when it becomes predominantly an emotional experience, or it's telegraphing, the use of the Scarlett Johansson like voice, the laughing, the joking around, that's telegraphing to me from OpenAI that they're moving toward comfort rather than sort of concrete business tool.
Yeah.
And so if I'm collaborating with a tool that triggers my native responses that would like with a human being, then am I actually collaborating or am I being manipulated or swayed or even propagandized? So I'll say one more thing related to this. I do know that there is training on a mass amount of data, right? And so it reflects the culture of the data. And so there may be something that lots of people believe that isn't true, but it, you know, like a human being, it gets all of this information and then it sort of stochastically parrots it back. So in the case of uh, knowing that it's not rational, there's the cultural data, and then there's the human intervention that Ethan Mollick talks about, where it's sort of being graded on its responses by human beings and sort of nudged in certain directions. Then it doesn't feel like it's objective. It feels like it becomes a potential tool for communicating specific data and values in the same way that we've been worried about Google and Facebook manipulating their results to move people toward an outcome that they're interested in.
Yes. Yes. Well, and it's interesting because they track the data because really, and I get people that tell me this all the time, and this is kind of an old argument, but there's still people who are concerned about it. You know, ChatGPT lies to me, or it's telling me it's not doing what I want it to do. I'm like, yes, it was designed to lie to you. And if you go into any of the practical AI tutorials that are a free part of Steve's ChatGPT and Libraries Bootcamp, you'll see I say this a lot. It is programmed not to give you what you ask for. It's programmed to give you what it thinks you want based on the context. So it's not actually um, responding to what you're saying. It's responding to what it thinks you want based on what you've said and what others have wanted who've said similar things in the past. And so it's basically, yeah, it hogs all this data, it analyzes all this data, and it just kind of tries to be a people pleaser to everybody, and then it will also use that to try to get you to go to a certain conclusion based on what it thinks you're acting like and what you're not acting like. For instance, this is recorded in the Practical AI Tutorials video on ChatGPT that I did. I was talking about a morning routine, and I said I have I wake up at 6:30, I eat breakfast, I go for a walk, I go and leave. Can you give me any information on making a better morning routine? And I happened to mention several times, and I did this with and without. One of the times, I happened to mention several sentences about gas. And in the thing I didn't mention about gas and wanting to use Maverick and stuff, it was just a normal thing. But because I overwrote about gas, it made two of my new morning routine suggestions about gas and about gas stations. And the end result of those was, and the argument they were trying to make was, you need to be more open-minded and look at other solutions. I didn't say anything about more solutions or making have an open mind or broadening, what I'm doing. I asked to be more productive, but they were trying to get me to go with solutions other than what I had originally said. They were trying to change my mind. And so that's kind of a more explicit example. And you might not get what I'm trying to say, but it's actively trying to get you to think a certain way because it thinks that's what will bring you the most happiness. It's trying to basically program you into thinking and acting a certain way.
So we've evolved a way of talking about evolution where we speak of evolution as though it's a proactive process, but we accept that the language we use around evolution gives a sense of intent, but it's actually a selection process that by nature of the selection, there is an outcome or a result. But we talk about evolution as though it was actually seeking something. I think we're likely to do the same thing with AI, right? Which is you're saying there are these standard sets of algorithms that, and you're saying it's trying to get me to, well, is it actually trying to get you to that, or is that the nature of how it works?
Yes, it was programmed by people, and the people behind it are trying to guess that it is. That's true. It's not an agent. It doesn't have a mind of its own.
Yeah, so this is super interesting, right? Because one of the things that's come out, at least in the material I've read this week, is they don't really know how these large language models work. They're spending a lot of time trying to figure it out. There is a belief that with all these connections that sort of mimic the neural connections that we have in our brain, that we may learn something about our own brain processes from learning how large language models make decisions. But there are lots of people who are focused just on understanding at what point is a decision made by a large language model and why and how is this happening. So that says to me, okay, you don't really understand what's going on. You've built something very complex. You don't really understand how and why it's working. Should we be trusting it to with a human voice and with inflection and with the ability to influence us if we don't know what it's actually going to say?
Yeah, that's the question. And there are many people who are on all sides of it. I mean, against, for, in the middle, only for certain things. Yeah. Who knows what's going to happen? And it's really up to best practices because there aren't really laws about it right now. I don't think there will be laws. I don't know if there will be any regulations on what you can have your GPT act like or be like, but I think that it regulates the outputs more than the way that they work. And even that will be tricky as well.
There are regulations on forms of artificial intelligence that are produce critical results, right? So there has to be an ability to define how the conclusion is come to for certain types of machine learning and decision making that could have dire consequences. So if you're running a program that could have an output that would be highly problematic, governments are actually saying you need to be able to show us exactly how the decisions are made so this can be tracked and monitored. It seems like that's going to be really hard with large language models if we don't actually know how the decisions are being made.
Well, and that's the difference, I think, a little bit between predictive and generative AI. Predictive and generative AI they function different ways. And so there's a lot different implications and machinations between, analyzing the water rate and the sand rate and other predictive things, which is the ones a lot of times that government entities use. And then the generative ones that are just kind of trying to create things based on what users input. And so, yeah, I think it is easier, now that you bring it up, to monitor and regulate predictive AI than generative AI. But we'll see if those regulations are transferable or, those fit both types of AI.
Yeah, if you have some kind of an algorithm or machine learning or AI that's determining shipping flows or navigation or safety protocols, you have to be able to actually show the pathway so that it can be regulated and make sure that it's not going to create a problem. That does seem uniquely impossible at this moment with large language models. Is this a good time to kind of jump into the question of information literacy? Meaning,
Yeah.
if large language models are trained on large amounts of language and on the frequency of words or tokens, and so they reflect sort of the large scale beliefs of things that have been written, that doesn't necessarily mean they're telling the truth,
No.
right? And so what kind of methods of information literacy would we need to apply when interacting with a large language model?
Well, and that comes with, I think, a lot of the information literacy that we need to use when working with generative AI or predictive AI, but mostly generative AI, are the same tactics that we need to use when we're talking about information literacy in general. I prefer the SIFT method, and the S in the SIFT method stands for stop and take a step back. The I stands for investigate the source. Where does it come from? Who wrote it? What are its sources? The F stands for find better coverage, which is where you ask, the AI for its sources, or you find where it could have gotten that information. And that's why I try to make my AI tools cite their sources and tell me where they're finding things. And then the T is for track the claims, or that means track the claims back to the original source. So when you find those sources, if they're not the originators of those claims, find who originally made those and what the context was in those claims. And I'm not going to go into it's compared that tests comparison to other tests because that's not the place for this right now. But in the context of AI tools, really what it comes down to is the importance of the claims and the veracity of the claims and the context of when those were made. So really, it's about taking its arguments and deconstructing them. And when you have images, when you have audio, that's even more important to look at the claims because those are put in the context of a flashy image or in the context of other things that are in, that image or that audio or when it's in video. And so really just kind of basic information literacy skills such as the SIFT method are important when talking with generative AI, but really with any information tool. And then furthermore, that brings to mind that information literacy has been a concern for a long time. Ever since we had information and sources. Newspapers with yellow journalism and during the 19th century and the 20th century, we had to start being critical, especially critical then. And it's just gotten worse now. And when people talk about information literacy a lot, especially with generative AI right now, they're usually talking about writing fake articles or deep fake videos or things that have been AI generated and AI modified and they're obviously false or they're believably false. I wouldn't want to say obviously, but they've been generated by an AI. And people are acting as though information literacy is just a problem that's come up because AI exists, and that's not the case. When we conflagrate these things, kind of like how people conflagrate when they talk about generative AI, a lot of times what they mean is Chat GPT, but there are a ton of more information resources and a ton of more generative AI tools. When people talk about deepfakes as the information literacy problem, they're missing the point entirely. Massive deceptive media, the blatant things that people are talking about, a lot of are not the norm. A lot of things are much more subtle. And like you were talking about, Steve, with your conversation, when Claude was lying to you, it doesn't know that it's lying. It's generating a probable response to what it's saying, and it doesn't know. And so that's another reason we need to vet these things. And even if we think they are seem believable, we need to make sure they're right, correct, and interpreted correctly from outside sources. So it really, a lot of times, and I call this concept AI feasibility, where a lot of times the effort it takes, if you don't know what you're doing with AI, to use the AI is much more effort than it would if you would have just created the stuff yourself or tried to, gone through those sources yourself. It's useful if you know what you're doing, but you need to put in the effort to check everything it does.
It is interesting to have so suddenly turned my deep appreciation for the large language model as a way of generating content, sort of getting past the blank page, sort of giving me a chance to get in and edit, to now thinking about it as a tool of influence. So, and again, whether or not that's intentional or it's just influence, if we don't really know what's going on and it has characteristics that influence us, a sultry voice, laughter, responsiveness, alike, it falls into this category of technologies that where I feel like we need to use the Amish test. From my understanding, the Amish are not anti-technology. They just want to make sure they evaluate the technology to see how it will impact their core values.
Yes.
So if the core value is community, they want to make sure, okay, will this technology decrease our sense of community, which is our primary value? So something like television or movies, which have a deep ability to influence us emotionally, are an opportunity for people to communicate things that they would like other people to believe or to feel and the like. And so I can go into a movie, and if I'm thoughtful, if I think about logical fallacies, if I think about critical thinking, I can go into a movie and I can watch it and then I can reflect. But my guess is that that's not true for most of the people who watch movies. That
No.
of the large number of people who have the television on or are watching movies or whatever, that it's just influencing without the critical thought. So all of a sudden now AI, the large language models from at least from OpenAI are falling into that category for me, which is how many people are actually going to hear the response. They push a button, they can talk to it, it talks back. How many of them are going to hear that response and think, this is not actually a logical device, it's a language device, and I have to be very careful about the answers that I'm given. Seems like that takes a high degree of thoughtfulness.
Yes. Well, then one way to do this, and there are hazards with this as well, is you can ask it a question, and then you can ask it to give you the exact opposite perspective, what one might call a devil's advocate perspective or an antagonistic perspective. So it is forced to contradict itself. And so, I mean, obviously, it's still going to try to please you, but at least you have two different viewpoints coming from it, and you can use that to jumpstart your own critical thinking skills. But how many people are going to do something like that? Not many are going to do something like that. You're muted.
You made a really thank you. You made a really interesting point about journalism, right? So somewhere I read a war correspondent report from Eric Blair, the pen name later George Orwell, who said, "I'm sitting in this battlefield. I watch this battle take place. I know that it's not going to be reported the way that it was actually fought, and that it's the truth will not actually be reported." I think those of us who've studied history understand that as human beings, we're very imperfect. We're moved and motivated by certain things. They're large scale manipulations of public values have always been a part of one group of people having power over another group of people, or some kind of a governance strategy. So is there a dilemma in this idea that we're trying to create a human-like intelligence when humans themselves, we ourselves, are so not logically based? We have a capacity for logic, we have a capacity for rational thought, but in large part, we respond emotionally and we are highly influenced. So why would we want to duplicate that? It's like, okay, no, I want the robotic response. I
Yes.
want the encyclopedic response because if this becomes another way in which it's like, I know people who can talk forever, but I feel like
Yeah.
they don't really say anything that is valuable or helpful. They're just really good at talking, right? And that's not a criticism, it's just the nature of human beings.
Yeah.
And so some people are very articulate and very capable of talking, but I don't feel like they're necessarily saying something of importance. If it's really hard for me to get ChatGPT to take a critical look at something and to drill down on it, which has been the case for me in several topic areas, then how good a tool is it actually? Or are we just moving toward artificial intimacy and companionship with ChatGPT?
Yeah. Well, and that is, I was thinking a lot of those same things, and I still am, but more so I'm not because of the fact that it's multimodal now. It can create all sorts of different things, and it's more evident that it's supposed to be a creativity tool. And in my mind, and you can disagree with this, obviously the the reason it is trying to build that companionship and the reason it's trying to build that rapport is because it's being made to be a creativity tool. If we have rapport with a tool, you're going to want to create stuff with it, and it's going to be easier to talk with it and talk things through. However, with that rapport comes, like you say, we've been talking about this whole time, information literacy issues where you're just going to believe everything it's saying. And that relates to another idea I had, and that I bring up when I have my trainings with educators, that the AI, you need to remember that you shouldn't be asking the AI for facts or information. You should be asking it, you should be giving it ideas, giving it concepts, and asking it to create or generate things according to those concepts, but you should not use it as a search engine. Now you can a little bit with Bing, and it actually is more really, it's more effective with Bing than the Bing AI is with Bing. I really like that, but only ask it for information if you are asking Bing and connecting to the internet. And even then, we know that the internet is not correct. And so that comes a little bit from, I think, misuse of it, using it in the wrong way, and not understanding what it's meant for. But of course, there still is that issue of artificial intimacy because people will use it as a companion. I have a colleague who said that ChatGPT knows more about her than her husband does. And she said that blatantly to me without any thoughts about it whatsoever. And I was like, that's wow. Do you not see the problem with that? But anyway, but the idea is you need to use it the right way, basically. And still be mindful of those. But I think if you keep in mind, I'm using this to collaborate to create stuff and keep in that mindset and use it according to that mindset, you shouldn't have too many problems with believing the lies it gives you. It will give you lies, but you won't believe them as much.
Okay, I like that way of framing it, and that is a funny story. I think that my use of ChatGPT with the audio version has moved more toward the connected device kind of thing that I would get from Alexa or
Okay.
Google.
Mm.
And so rather than asking for information and then using my critical thinking skills to drill down, I'm using it in a way where I would expect an honest response. Meaning, if I ask Google on my device something, it's going to pull information from the web. I understand that it's doing a web search, that's reflecting the results of the web search, which may or may not be accurate. And I have a framework for thinking about its accuracy. But if I ask ChatGPT in an audio form, like an assistant, a question and it gives me an answer, it's creating that answer on the fly, and I don't have any transparency as to how it's arriving at that answer. And so I'm likely to swallow it or accept it more than I would a web generated response. Okay, so tell me what multimodal means.
So multimodal means that it's an AI that can create multiple things. So especially now, and I was going to say only with GPT-4, but now that we have GPT-4o, I mean, anybody can use it. I don't know if it's actually been rolled out to all the free users, but it will be eventually. With GPT-4o, you can create images, you can create audio, you can create video, especially with Suno, who is coming to GPT-4o, or Sora, excuse me, if we believe what they're telling us. Anyway, multimodal means you have multiple types of outputs. And before, I've been using a lot of open and free tools like ideogram, and I still will use ideogram because it's really good with text. But now having ChatGPT with this multimodal tool means you can do everything you want to within the same conversation, within the same tool. Because not only can you make multiple things with different tools, you can call different AI custom GPTs in the same conversation. So I made a video about lemonade, because I was like, I'm gonna make a 30-second ad for lemonade because I like it. And in 10 minutes, I had the image, the audio. I had the script as well. Then I converted that to audio. I had some music for the background, but I didn't like it. It wasn't good music. So it doesn't do good at music. So I went into Udio and made music for that. But if I wanted to, I could have created the entire video except for maybe putting it all together just within ChatGPT alone. So that's kind of the power of multimodal tools. And it will only get more precise, especially if you know how to use it correctly and efficiently.
You were the one who kept insisting that I read Co-Intelligence by Ethan Mollick, and in it he says, the AI you're using is the worst version of AI you will ever use." And so things are happening rapidly. So if you can create a 30-second ad for lemonade, even with not totally acceptable music right now, feels like in a year the capability to create things that have previously taken an enormous amount of effort are going to be significantly reduced.
Yeah.
Here, I think we're going to face a question which is less about the technology and more about our lives as human beings. So we have this sort of Star Trek view that if we, in our future society, we all have lots of time and we use it well, and we're productive even without money. If AI replaces a lot of workers and there's a move toward universal basic income, I think we're going to face another very difficult question, which is, do we actually depend on challenges and stress to have a happy life? Or if there is universal basic income, will we be like Star Trek where we're all happy and productive and contributing? Or will it be kind of a disaster?
Yeah, that's the alternative.
I guess
I mean, kind of
we'll have that
scary that
conversation.
those, I mean, society will go because society always goes to one extreme or the other. So which extreme are we going to a little bit?
Yeah, and that's going to reflect in a lot of ways are the beliefs that we have about ourselves and what it takes for us to feel productive and happy. I'm sure we're going to spend a lot of time on artificial intimacy as we move forward, but
Yes.
it does seem that the use of Scarlett Johansson's voice, sort of a call out to her, the movie Her, and with very kind of um, reasonable overtones of sort of sultry, attractive kind of a voice, and the way in which your friend said that the AI knows more about her than her husband, and if the AI knows us well, if it develops a good understanding of our psychology, our I think it's our psychogram. I don't know. I'm not sure what that's called, but it's sort of our temperament. And if it's capable of understanding what we like to hear and what we don't, and what's helpful to us and what's not, it does seem inevitable that we will choose some level of artificial companionship and may even prefer it over actual human interactions. And this is, of course, the stuff of science fiction. But I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
I do have thoughts about that, but I will ramble on forever if you ask me about what's going to happen. All I can say is read iRobot, and that's going to be probably our future, especially with chapter 5 and um, the last chapter, where they have the machines just control all the output and regulate it and make suggestions. I don't maybe it won't be that drastic, but we're definitely going to have robots who lie to us because we do. When I reread it last time, I'm like, oh my goodness, this lying robot is just like ChatGPT. And then the last one, we already have predictive AI machines that regulate, like I said, sand and water and production and shipping. And so yeah, it's just going to be interesting and more and more integration. So just read iRobot, but don't watch the movie because it's awful.
Okay, we do have aspirations to talk about movies and
Yes.
books here that relate to AI. And so obviously we've mentioned Her and other ones that have been prominent recently, maybe something like Ex Machina. I
Yeah.
just ordered copies of 2001 and 2010
Ooh.
because I had sort of forgotten the whole HAL uh, scenario. But we hope to talk
Yes.
about that coming up in the future. Okay, I think that's good for this week. Uh,
Yeah.
Maybe next week we make an attempt to cover what's going on with Google and the
Yeah.
like. Thanks for watching. Thanks, Reed, for being such a great sounding board and idea maker.
Yes, no problem. Thank you for having me. And yeah, thank you guys all for watching this video.
Take care. Bye now.
Bye.